Well, there are many things that you need to think about when you are choosing a topic and getting ready to create a research question. And for many people, the problem with choosing a topic often ends up being that it's just way too broad of a topic when they feel like they've already narrowed it down. So we know we're going to start out with a broad topic. When I was getting ready to do a master's thesis, which I eventually ditched that and just did the full-fledged dissertation and wrote on a completely different topic, but I had a very broad understanding of what I wanted to do with the master's thesis. I was supposed to be studying U.S. foreign policy toward Latin America in the Reagan years. Well, some people would consider that to be a narrow topic. It is not. I mean, think about that. Think about the idea of how many Latin American countries there are. Think about all of the different policies that Reagan had. Think about the understanding that people had about the relationship between the United States and Latin America. What exactly is it that you're going to talk about? What exactly is it that you're going to research? What exactly is it that you're going to create a thesis about? And what exactly is it you're going to argue? And it's a very broad topic, right? You want a broad topic when you're first thinking about your topic. So you can start doing some preliminary research. And the preliminary research is what's going to get you to the point to understanding what's out there. Okay. So let's talk about that first broad topic. The idea that you really want to work on a very, very interesting topic to you, but that might be just a little bit too broad, like, say, my foreign policy topic, right? So you have a somewhat of an idea of what it is that you want to do. So you do a quick Google search. I always suggest the Google search for one reason. It really gets you an understanding of what's out there across the board, right? You can look for academic sources for sure, but you can see what journalists have written about it. You can see if it's actually part of the popular culture too. Most of the things you're going to find on Google are not going to be reliable sources for you. But my point is that you get your finger on the pulse of whether or not people are going to be interested in your topic, whether or not your topic is relevant. And then if you delve more deeply into academic sources, you'll be able to tell whether or not this is something that is a part of a field or a part of a field of study within history, right? So it gives you like a quick understanding of multiple things and varying things about your topic. I always suggest to people when they're trying to find a topic, don't let anybody else pick it out for you. Don't let anybody else let you think that oh, well, this is an important topic, right? This is something that you should be discussing. My dissertation advisor wanted me to focus on very specific politicians within my dissertation. It was something that was completely disinteresting to me. It just wasn't something that I was interested in. I was totally disinterested in the idea of, as I've mentioned in a different lecture, of doing oral history with particular politicians, right? So I was just not interested in it at all. So you need to do something that's of interest to you. You don't want to do something because you think it's what the profession wants you to do. You don't want to do it because one of your professors thinks you should do it. You just want to be able to work on something that is as important to you. So one of the ways that I always suggest, you've taken a wide variety of classes already to get to this point in your bachelor's degree. So you probably have worked on something that you're already interested in. Again, something broad, okay? Doesn't have to be something super specific. So say you were in poli-sci class and you were like, I really was interested in the economic policies of the Calvin Coolidge era, and what went wrong, okay? Well, that's very, very broad again, but it's something that allows you to um, start focusing on and honing down what it is that you want to do with your topic. So it's something you've heard about before, something you've been interested before, something you tripped over when you were looking at a different topic. Um, for some people, they enjoy topics that are highly controversial. I always have students that want to do conspiracy theories for assassinations. I have students that want to already fast forward through the to the Donald Trump era and discuss that, which is controversial in multiple aspects, right? It's politically controversial, but it is also controversial because it's not really history, right? It's not history yet. You can discuss multiple other presidencies than in relation to the Trump presidency, but doing something that's specifically about Trump isn't going to work yet, right? There's not enough distance between the topic and the field of study, right? You really need to have. Most people say about 20 years. I say about 10. But I'm a modern historian, so that's one of the reasons why I say that. But most people say about 20 years, right? You need to have the value of that space in order to have something that you are not biased about, or to have something that your sources are not going to be biased about, right? So if you're curious about something controversial, that's obviously going to pique your interest, right? So it's something that you could do for a topic. Some people like sleeper topics. So these are topics that maybe have been dabbled in terms of the profession, but they are things that really need to be delved into much more deeply. And people want to do that because they know it's an easy way to make a contribution, right? All of your work as a historian has to make some form of a contribution to the profession, some form of a contribution to the historiography, right? So a sleeper topic is an easy way of doing that. But again, it's an easy way to have a broad topic at first that you can start whittling down. Another way that people pick their topics is that they already know the historiography of their topic, right? They already know what's out there, and for many people, what they want to do when they already know the historiography is they want to challenge the historiography, and that's an extremely interesting topic to move into, right? If you want to challenge something about what most professional historians have said about a topic, it's clearly going to be something that becomes very exciting for you to do, right? So these are some ways that you find a topic, but again, it's going to be super broad at this point, right? And you're going to start chiseling away at what it is that you want to look at, and also chiseling away at what sources are out there. So just before you start going through the process of whittling down your more broad topic, there's something that you want to do with that broad topic, and that is to make sure that it has adequate sources. Okay. If the broader topic has adequate sources, you know that there's going to be enough stuff out there for you to delve into more specific areas, right? So you know that there are a lot of people who are out there who have written on the topic. You know there are a lot of primary sources out there on the topic, and you know that you're going to somewhere within those sources, as you're taking your preliminary look, you are going to find something that you can narrow your topic down to, and something to create a research question out of, right? You have to make sure that whatever your question is, as you start creating it in your mind, that it's something that can be reasonably answered, right? So whether or not there's adequate sources obviously illustrates that to you, okay? Can something be reasonably answered with the amount of sources that you have, primary as well as secondary? Also, and I kind of mentioned this before in terms of when you're doing that initial search, you want to make sure that your topic is important. You want to make sure it's important to the academy. You want to make sure that it's important to the profession. And you also want to make sure that it's important to the general public. And as I mentioned, when you do that Google search, you're really going to be able to see how interested the general public is in that broader topic, right? You want to keep all of these things in mind as you continue to whittle things down too. You want to make sure that whatever it is that you're looking at, that you still have adequate sources, that it still can be reasonably answered, and that it is important for someone to study. Okay, so let's move on and start thinking about how to do preliminary research in order to whittle that topic down and move toward a very reasonable research question. So you've got that broad topic, and how are you going to whittle it down? And how are you going to then start moving toward that ever important research question about your topic. You're going to want to take an initial preliminary look first as to what's out there on the topic. This moves beyond that Google search, right? You want to look at historiographies. You want to look at primary source collections, what's out there in terms of collections that relate to the topic. You want to make sure that you have looked outside of your discipline. What are people in political science doing? What are people in, say, different areas of the humanities doing? What is it that academics are doing in terms of your topic? Is somebody already taking the same tack that you are in terms of the topic and the project? And also looking at other academics to see if it can take you down a different road, right? You don't always have to be looking to the historian, right? You want to start with the historians, but then you start branching out and looking at other academics. You want to look at book reviews that tell you what the latest monographs are, and even what some of the more traditional monographs are about your topic. You want to look into bibliography, subject headings, and call numbers when you're at the library, when you're looking over the library website. What are some of the subject headings that you see that are related to your research? Where do you necessarily see your topic in bibliographies of other monographs? So you might have something that is a very, very broad discussion. Say it's the history of capitalism, right? And you're looking at the bibliography, but you want to be looking at capitalism in the United States in the late 19th century. So you're looking through bibliographies and books on capitalism and the history of capitalism, whether it's world capitalism or capitalism in the United States, to see what's in those bibliographies, right? To see what's already out there. You may also want to go to a museum or another public history venue to see what, again, we talk about, what the finger that's on the pulse of the greater public, right, in terms of your topic. So that's a great way of looking at that and seeing what the general interest would be in your topic. Also, museums and public history venues will give you a different look at what it is that people are interested in as you try to whittle the topic down, right? What are some important aspects of looking at, say, capitalism in industrialized cities, right? What is it about industrialized cities that you want to know? Well, maybe the museum can maybe spark something in you. Say you see a Lewis Hines picture of a child in a factory, right? And you're like, oh, maybe that's something that I would want to look at and want to whittle my topic down to child labor in the capitalist system in the United States in the late 19th century, right? So it's something that you can see. It's tangible, it's in front of you in terms of the museum, and it allows you to know what the general public might be interested in, but it may just spark your own interest in something that maybe you haven't thought of that a public historian already has, okay? You also, as you're looking at your sources, your historiography, your primary source collections, monographs by historians, other pieces of work by academics, journal articles, things like that, you want to look at questions that are raised in your sources, whether they're raised by the author themselves, whether they're raised in book reviews about your topic, or they're raised in your head as you're reading through your sources. Those things are going to allow you to break down your topic and get more in depth in your topic to create the research question. So the historiographies are going to obviously tell you what's already been done. They're going to tell you whether or not you want to challenge that historiography or whether you see something that's missing in that historiography, right? The primary source collections are going to allow you to whittle things down because you're going to know what's out there because the primary sources are going to have to drive your research, right? The work of other academics is not only going to help you to understand your topic, but it's also going to tell you whether or not you are actually you're actually looking at something that somebody has overdone outside of history. Now, maybe you would be able to take a different look at it in terms of using the historical toolbox, right? The historian's toolbox. But you want to know whether or not you're beating a dead horse in terms of a topic, right? The book reviews allow you to do that too, but they will allow you to raise those questions about your topic to see what's missing, right? Or to see if you can find in the vast literature that's out there something that you feel has been neglected, right? So these are all things that you, as you're looking through all of these sources, these questions may be raised in your mind, or they may actually be raised by historians that are reviewing books, or raised by the historians that are actually doing the academic research and saying this is not something that I'm going to be able to focus on, or I can't get to this particular archive, or this really isn't what I'm looking at, but this is really interesting, and I want to, they end up mentioning it like in their introduction or their conclusion, right? So you know that there's going to be questions that are raised by other people and by you as you're looking through your preliminary research on your topic. And those questions more often than not push us toward making the decision about the more narrow topic and then creating an actual research question. I also suggest that when you're trying to create a research question, when you're trying to figure out what topic you want to do, and how you're going to whittle it down, and then how you're going to create a good research question that's not going to lead you down way too many paths. Talk to professors. Go to your professors and ask them what it is that they think about the topic, what it is that they know that's already out there about your topic. And then again, I can't stress enough talking to an everyday person, right? Talking to somebody who's a member of the public, somebody in your family, friends, people who aren't necessarily as steeped in history as you are, but actually might have an interest in your topic. Because the more interesting your topic is to the average everyday layperson, you are going to notice that that's going to have an effect on how it is viewed in the academy, right? So you're really going to be able to understand what it is that's going to make your public palatable to a larger audience, but it's also going to make it significant. So after you have done that initial preliminary look, which was that Google search that I was talking about, and then you move into the preliminary examination of your topic, where you're starting to whittle down the topic and move much closer to creating a research question, you're going to finally want to get to the full look, which is where you get specific. This is where you're doing analysis of your topic via your sources, and that analysis eventually leads you to a very specific topic and a very specific research question. You can't get to your research question without having done all of those other steps. One of the main reasons why is because you want to see what's already out there. You don't want to duplicate somebody else's work. You must have original research as a historian. If you're an academic historian, your research needs to be original. It can't be a parroting back of something somebody's already done. It can't mirror what somebody else has already done, right? It has to be something that you are adding to our understanding of the topic. It has to be something where you are maybe even changing the way people look at the topic, okay? So this is the analysis portion. This is where you get to, you've already been looking at sources, you've already been picking things out and really trying very hard to whittle that research topic and then research question down. This is really where you're getting to the analysis, right? So that whittling down this area to me is where, number one, you're getting to the more narrow topic, but that analysis that you're doing with your sources, going back to the primary sources, looking at the monographs and journal articles, what's already out there, that analysis is what's going to push you to your research question. And that research question is going to allow you, because you've done so many research, you've made sure that you've done so much research, rather, in terms of your topic at this point, that you already are pointing yourself towards your main conclusion and thesis. So you get to the point where your research question, you don't want your thesis before you create the research question, but you have the when as you're creating the research question, you have that analysis that's already done. That by the time you've created the question, the answer is already starting to bubble up, right? It's already starting to pop up in your mind. And the main reason why is that you've been looking at a trail of sources over and over and over again, trying to refine a topic. And you've eventually realized that you've already done a great deal of your analytical work. Again, when you're trying to get to the point where you've got a good enough topic to create a research question, you want to make sure that you're looking at trends, debates, uncertainties, and something that's interesting. And we haven't talked about the idea of trends and debates and uncertainties in the sense of when you're moving toward actual analysis, right? So we've talked about it in terms of, oh, this would be a great topic. What are the trends out there? What are the debates? What are the uncertainties? But once you get to the point where you are creating the research question, this is where you really need to know what's going on in the historiography. This is where you really need to know so that your analysis of the topic is something that is new, it's original, and it's significant, and may even find its way into the historiography of the actual topic of study. Okay, so making sure that you see those trends allows you to again, not duplicate somebody else's work, but also expand on the trend or move historians to a completely different trend, okay, jumping off of an older trend. You want to be able to know the historical debates about your topic, because if you know the historical debates about your topic, then clearly your analysis is going to be driven by whether or not your work fits into that debate or whether you've created a completely new wing of the debate, okay? And the uncertainties, what is it that the historians don't know? That could lead you to an amazing research question because it's something that people really haven't delved into, or it's something that there's a great deal of uncertainty about how we got from point A to point B, or a great deal of uncertainty about how things changed over time, right? So when you get to this point, this is where your analysis is really driving not just the whittling down of the topic, but your analysis is really moving you toward having a major research question and already formulating an answer to that research question because you've already done so much legwork, okay? You have to make sure that your question is narrow and narrow to the set of sources that you have found, okay? You're already going to know that because of all the things that I told you, right? All of the things that you've already done. Go following the trail of the sources, really digging into them, seeing what their analysis is, doing your own analysis, and then obviously recognizing where you fit into the profession in terms of your topic. So you really need to make sure that you've narrowed things down, but you need to make sure that you have the set of sources there, okay? And that the sources are going to work for you. So you're narrowing down your sources at the same exact time that you're narrowing down the actual topic. And eventually, I can't stress this enough, that the question that you've created as you've moved from this very broad topic to a more narrow one, to a more narrow one, and you've done the analysis to create the research question, I can't stress to you enough how quickly it's going to turn into an argument, how quickly that research question is going to turn into something that you are going to argue and use evidence to prove and back up. It comes to you quite naturally, okay, if you're doing all of these previous steps that I mentioned. Now, I always tell students when they're creating a research question to make sure that they don't make their mind up on the final research question. They don't start trying to answer that research question until you get to the final round of your analysis. So you've gone through all of these stages of preliminary research, right? And you've gotten to that third stage of really getting to know your topic in a really intimate sort of way. and you need to finally create the major research question that's going to allow you to walk through the rest of your process to create a thesis and then to actually sit down and prove the thesis with your evidence, right? So I always say don't make up your mind on your research question until you're through that final round of analysis, and don't start thinking about creating a thesis until you get through that as well, because you're just doing work that you're going to have to redo later, right? If you're doing it in that second phase that I was talking about, you really end up being somebody who needs to consistently recraft their research question, let alone their thesis. Okay. So I always say wait till that final round of analysis, know where it is that you're going, and start actually formulating not just the research question, but your answer to it, because those things really go hand in hand. If you're walking through this three-step process, it really is that by the time you get to that last stage of what's supposedly preliminary research, you know a lot of information. And in knowing all of that information, you are able to start drawing conclusions, right? And those conclusions eventually are going to shape into your thesis. So it's really important at this point to not be second guessing yourself. And that's why I always say wait till that final round and make sure that you have a significant amount of analysis under your belt already. And it's really going to make the process of the research question and then sifting through your research again for the answer to create the thesis, and then to prove the thesis, that it's really, I mean, that's really the process that you need to walk yourself through. And if you do that, by the time you start creating the thesis and then also writing and proving it, you've done so much work that the process goes quite smoothly. But one of the things that a lot of students don't do is they forget to put a purpose into their work. And again, don't confuse the purpose with the thesis. The thesis really is that very argumentative, analytical statement that you want to create. But you always have to have a purpose. You always have to have a reason for studying something. And that goes hand in hand with creating a research question. If you were doing a prospectus, say for your dissertation, you would be asked these questions, right? What process did you go through to formulate a research question? What was your research question, and how did you jump off of it to do more research and analyze your materials in a way that allowed you to come up with the thesis that you have created, right? And in that process, you have to explain to people what your true purpose was. Why did you write this? Why did you come up with the research question? Why did you even come up with the topic, right? And you have to prove why it was important to you and why you think it's an important part of the field in which you study, right? So I have two very specific purposes here, okay? I am studying environmental legislation passed in the 1970s because I want to know why and how such stringent laws were passed. I want to do this in order to help my reader understand how environmental legislation gets created and passed. So you're explaining something, right? And even though you'll have an argument to that actual paper, you clearly are illustrating that you want to not only prove something to your reader, but to inform your reader. That you want your reader to walk away from your paper with not just having, sort of intellectually sparred with you in their heads, but that they actually walk away with valuable information that allows them to continue to shape the narrative that you are trying to create and that they are trying to create in their head. So that you have been shaping it, and now they're trying to shape it too, by understanding what you have to say and knowing that your purpose was to explain this to them, right? So you also have another purpose here that I put down, that obviously leads somebody through the research question and then also through the thesis and proving it. I am studying environmental legislation passed in the 1970s because I want to know the historical context that gave rise to this legislation. I want to do this in order to help my readers understand the historical significance of environmental legislation in the 1970s. Yeah, it's pretty self-explanatory, right? That purpose is basically telling you that the person wants to give historical context for legislation and to allow the reader to understand why this is so significant. And you can only figure out the significance via the historical context. Okay, so these are very specific purposes. So we've already run through creating a research question, which you're going to answer with a thesis statement. But we've also run through the idea that you have to have a purpose for everything you do, and you need to be able to explain that to people as to why it is that you're studying what you study and why it is that you are focusing on a very specific aspect of it and what it is that you want to give your reader or give the profession when you actually write your piece of work. So whether you're doing your preliminary research or you're going through your research again and adding to it so that you can actually create a thesis and finish and actually write and finish up your paper and finish up your project. You really need to know how to note take, and you also need to know how to read a book. So let's start with reading a book, because obviously that comes a bit before actually sitting down and writing notes on your book or your sources. Okay. So, number one, to read a book, I know that a lot of people tell you to look at the index of a book, but most indices are um, put together by research assistants, or they are put together by people who aren't really close to the project at hand. So if the index is not created by the person who is writing the book or the person who is editing the book for you, the index really is iffy to look at in terms of knowing that that's the be all end all of what's in the book. Okay. It's not that you shouldn't use the index, it's just that you shouldn't use it as like the Bible for the book, right? That everything that you need is right there and that you can look it up, because often things are missed. Okay. Also, I suggest, table of contents, people tell you to do that. I think you should obviously look at the table of contents to see what the roadmap is for the book that you're reading. However, again, a lot of really important things are left out of the table of contents. So the table of contents really is just that roadmap, and you're going to have to go into the book to figure out what is important in the roadmap and what is important in terms of what the historian is writing about in order to see how it applies to your work, right? So you're going to have to delve into the book anyway. So this is how you delve into the book without actually reading it, okay? Number one, you read the introduction of the book. Number two, you read the conclusion of the book. There, if any historian that's worth their salt has given you already in the introduction the thesis, they've given you the purpose, and they've given you a little synopsis of what it is that they're going to be doing, right? The conclusion obviously is a reiteration of what they've done. So a reiteration of their thesis, a reiteration of the sub-theses, and then a reiteration of the actual conclusions that they made. So if you read the intro and the conclusion of a book, you clearly have a strong understanding of what this person is writing about, what the significance is of what they're writing about, and how well it's going to actually fit in with your work. If you're looking at a journal article, I also suggest the intro and the conclusion, but again, recognizing the fact that even though they're comprehensive introductions and conclusions, they're not going to tell you quite as much as the intro and conclusion for a monograph, right? The other thing that you want to know how to do with your research is to learn how to skim. And I don't care what it is, if you're looking at a scholarly journal article, even though it's short, you're still going to be skimming it because you have a pile of them to look through. Or if you're looking at a pile of monographs, you really need to know how to skim the book beyond looking at the intro and conclusion, because there's going to be things throughout the book that you need to pick up on. You not only need to understand what the book's about, you need to recognize certain areas of the book or journal article as being something that fits with your topic, right? So you don't want to just get an understanding of what the author is saying. You also want to get an understanding of what you can use from the book for evidence, right? So what I suggest is for you to skim the book, and the book in really its entirety. Well, that's easy to do. You've already looked at the intro, you've already looked at the conclusion of the book. Now what you want to do is look at the intro and conclusion of every single chapter. And then what you do after you have an idea of what it is that the author is trying to tell you in the chapter, you go back and you read at least the first sentence of every paragraph, or the first sentence and the last sentence of every paragraph to get you an understanding of what the author is trying to tell you. Now, you can actually move away from reading the first and last sentence of every paragraph if you're really just trying to get through the book to understand, where's the information at that I need. But if you need to understand the book in a more in-depth manner, you're going to want to have yourself sit down and actually read the first sentence and the second sentence of every paragraph. But it's a very quick way of getting through a full book. And if you cut that out and you just go through intro and conclusion of the book and then intro and conclusion of every chapter, you're really going to get a bare bones understanding of what the person is saying. And remembering again that history is about interpretation, right? So history is about you understanding how this person's work fits into the larger historical narrative or fits into the historical interpretations and the historiography, right? So it's not going to be necessary for you to get all the details. It's only when those books that are really, really important to your topic and you're going to go through them and fully skim the book in order to get an idea of where the major points of evidence are. It's only then that you're really going to go through this whole process. So again, intro and conclusion of the book and then intro and conclusion of every chapter is clearly going to give you a great understanding of what the book's about, what the argument is, maybe even if the author has proven the thesis, but it also allows you to understand the significance, which clearly is going to give you, what it is that how this book fits into the canon of interpretations for the historical profession, right? So it's really going to give you a bare bones understanding. I can't stress enough this idea of skimming, these two different types of skimming, right? Because it really is impossible for you to get through all the work. And what a historian wants to be is well grounded in the interpretations, not in the details, okay? So the more books you've looked at, the more journal articles that you've looked at, that you have a basic understanding of what this person is saying in their argument, if they've done a good job of proving it, and then also how it fits into the larger narrative and the larger canon, which is of historical interpretations, which is the historiography. If you have that, you have just about everything that you need to illustrate to people that you understand not only how the profession works, but understand what the profession has said about your topic, okay? It's about being as knowledgeable as you can be about the interpretations, and that really is very important to stress, okay? Another thing that you want to make sure that you're doing when you're looking at these books and when you're deciding, okay, how can I create for myself my own little like mini historiography of these books that I have? So I understand the significance of the books and I understand the major arguments so that I can put them together and then say to myself, okay, how am I going to use this in terms of my work? One of the things you have to do when you're doing that is to make sure that the work is up to date. Often we see scholars that di- reach rather really far back in the past and dip into the past in terms of historical interpretations. And some of those interpretations have already been disproven or they've fallen out of favor in the profession, right? So you want to make sure as a student and eventually even a graduate student that you not only know the historical interpretations, but you know which ones have fallen from grace, right? You know that you aren't bringing something back that people haven't been looking at for decades or haven't been looking at for years, right? So you want to make sure that your research and what you have in your research is up to date. Now, that's not to say that a book from, say, 1955 isn't going to work for you, because if that book is something that has remained within the canon, it's going to be fine for you to use. My point is that you really have to make sure that what you're looking at, the older it is, as to whether or not it's been pulled away from the historiography and that people aren't necessarily folding it in there when they're talking about a particular topic. So that's something that you have to make sure of. So I can't stress enough here this idea of, you have all of this research in front of you, so how do you get through it? Skim, skim, skim. Okay? So, what are some methods for taking notes? And in the current age, in the 21st century, which a lot of historians do not live in, by the way, I truly believe in particularly doing a great deal of your work on your computer, number one, I really highly recommend, instead of taking major notes, to actually take pictures of things. Not only did I do, when I was doing archival research for my dissertation, I not only created this idea that I would take pictures within the archives, which you can't always do, so you have to check with your archivist. But not only did I do that, because I had archives in California and archives in Washington, D.C., and archives in Columbia, South Carolina that I had gone to. So I really couldn't, easily get back there, right? So obviously I took pictures of those things, but I actually also took pictures of secondary sources. If I found very particular information that I wanted, I would take a picture of it so I could go back and look over it again. Then I would take notes in a Word document. And so if I was, we'll talk about, whether you should paraphrase and quote and all of that. But if I was doing that, if I was going to take something from that material, I actually would then type it up in a Word document. And it's really easy, to, obviously, to go back and forth between screens, or if you're lucky enough to have two screens, and you can. I have several colleagues that actually use, a desktop, an antiquated desktop, but they also use their laptop at the same time, so they can go back and forth and look, right. So they're reading off of one and typing on another, right. Obviously, you can do a split screen too. That would work for you as well. So, like I said, some historians do not live in the 21st century. But it to me, we really should take advantage of the technology that we have. So I take a lot of pictures, and then, like I said, I do notes within Word documents, and I also do a research journal in a Word document. But there are all these antiquated sort of ways of doing it, that things I wouldn't do, but I know that some people still are doing, which are note cards, and writing out things on note cards, doing photocopies, which for some archives that you can actually do photocopies, and sometimes that's the only way you can do it. When I first was going to the Reagan Library years and years ago, I could only do photocopies and pay for the photocopies, and they actually would photocopy a lot of it for me, because they didn't want me touching things beyond looking at them, right. They didn't want me putting it on the machine and all of that. So that was something that I had started out doing, but once I realized, and the Reagan Library had changed policies, and then I went to other archives, I was like, oh, I can just take pictures of these things. That's great, as long as the policy it's okay with it, right. And I do more modern stuff, so I don't have to worry about really ruining things, and I know that some of you who are doing, students that do medieval history, right? You can't necessarily do these things with those sources. So you kind of have to go with what your archive does. But you can always do this with secondary sources, right? You can always take pictures of secondary sources. You can also do the photocopying. So we don't necessarily think you should do note cards. And if you're going to be taking notes on your materials, I always suggest doing that on the computer. Some people actually put them in spreadsheets too. I think that the research journal is most interactive, but again, it can be done on a computer. You don't have to write it out by hand, right? So those are some methods. But what I want you to focus on, because everybody has their own way of doing it, and I don't mean to, like, I'm not, I guess I am poking fun, but I don't mean to poke fun at people who don't like the more modern advantages that we have. But it's really important for all of us, regardless of the way that we do our note taking, to do the notes in a very specific manner. And what I mean by that is, you really have to watch again that you're not going to plagiarize, right? That's one of the reasons why I really like taking the pictures, because I can still see the source. And if I need to take notes on the source, I can print it out if I want to actually write on the source itself, right? But when you are doing such intensive research and you're copying things down, you really need to make sure that you're writing in your own words, and that you're actually putting a note wherever it is, on the note card or the document note, like I do, that you are saying this is a summary or a paraphrase, and that you're making sure that you have done it in your own language, right? And we're going to talk about this again in the next slide, but it's imperative that you identify what it is that you're putting down as a summary, a paraphrase, or a quote. And for quotes, I always suggest to students to only pick things that you think prove significant points through a language or a tone that you couldn't do justice to in your own words. Or somebody like me that does rhetoric, I tend to use quotes because I want to use exact language so I can prove something with the exact language, right? But when most of the time when you are using sources, and especially secondary sources, you really want to make sure that you're writing things out in your own words, that you're taking the ideas of the person and then sort of rehashing them and putting them down in your own language, right? Um, you also want to make sure that not only you have, written in your own words or illustrated to yourself that it's a summary, a paraphrase, or a quote, that you also make sure that you have the full citation there with you. You don't want to have to go back for that later, okay? But for all intents and purposes, my bigger point here is the idea that you don't want to just copy things down word for word and then willy-nilly not even show that it's a quote, right? You want to make sure that you have told yourself it's a summary, a paraphrase, or a quote. You're never going to remember it when you come back. You really are not. And that you also have written down page numbers and you have the bulk of the information, even if you don't want to sit down and do the full citation, right? That always can be done later on, but you have to make sure that you put some sort of marking on whatever it is, saying, it's like the author and the actual name of the book, right? And then the page number. You don't have to go into full a formal citation mode, but you have to make sure there's some sort of citation on the note. Also, for me, like with the pictures, I would put notes on the side in the sidebar, saying to myself, this document written by this person, and even sometimes would take analysis notes at that point too, right? So note taking is something that is unique to you, but there are specific rules that really should be followed. So in our final slide on note taking, I want to sort of hammer home the point that you really should be very active when you're doing your note taking. And again, not just jotting down quotes, paraphrases, and summaries. And if you do, making sure that you tell yourself that's what it is, right? I paraphrase this from this book on this page, right? But don't just do that. Be present in your research. Don't just collect your photographs. Don't just collect your scans or photocopies. Don't just collect sources off the internet. Don't just collect books and secondary sources from the library. Making notes about your analysis really allows you to be interactive with the materials that you're looking at. And in being interactive with them really allows you to do a great deal of the process of analysis of your research before you've even sat down to even pre-write. Um, so that you're constantly thinking about it and constantly engaging with it and constantly making sure that you're not just going through the motions of collecting things, which is just the death knell for your work, because it takes so much more time. You have to come back, you have to go through everything again, right? So maintaining an active role in your research is really, really important. It cuts down on time, but the bigger thing to me is that you are just becoming immersed in your research. And when you become immersed in the research, that's when you have your greatest epiphanies, and that's when the best theses will eventually get down on the page, right? And the best evidence is going to come out too. You're going to shine in terms of your analysis if you're constantly engaging throughout this whole process. I really highly recommend the research journal. Okay. It allows you to make notes about your actual analysis, not just about your sources. You can discuss things like your main goals. You can write down, okay, well, this is what I've done. This is what I still need to complete. You can discuss your sources in a manner that tells you this relates to my research question or my preliminary thesis in this way. It answers this particular question. You can write about the connections you've made between sources. You can put down the segments of the sources that you're going to use, and you end up creating like this little portfolio for yourself that It's all about analysis, and it's all about how you can find the analysis again. You can find the evidence for the analysis, rather. And it's really just a great way of remaining engaged. And you can do it in other ways. And like I said, there's no right way to do it per se, in terms of if you uniquely like to take notes or you uniquely like to create spreadsheets. But I really think that all of us should focus on the idea of doing something like the research journal, so that you're constantly engaged with your analysis and with your sources and with your topic. I also suggest compiling a bibliography that you can check off consistently, in terms of, well, I've looked at this, I haven't looked at that. You can create a system for yourself to say, well, I'm going to use this as a reference work, but this work I'm actually using, and I have notes in terms of being able to use it for evidence. And I can't stress enough the idea of the annotated bibliography too. Annotated bibliographies are a great thing to do, and you don't always have time to do them. But you could even make yourself a cheat sheet. Like, you could say to yourself, like, have very particular headers in terms of what it is that you need or want to know from your sources, and then be able to put bullet points under those headers. That would work as well too for the annotated bibliography. That's not like one that you could turn into somebody, turn into a professor, but I mean for yourself. It's just like people tell you to make outlines, but when you're making an outline, it has to be specific to you. And not only do you have time constraints, but also, you might not like making an outline that has all of your sources plugged into it. Although I recommend kind of knowing where your sources do plug in. Some people just do like a whole source outline. Some people do just a narrative outline. Some people, I like to do keyword outlines. I actually make keyword outlines, and I start writing, then I redo the keyword outline, and it just allows me to continue to kind of edit what I'm doing in my mind, and then go back and fix things, or to continue to refine the work while I'm writing. But we all have our own ideas about how we should do outlines. So we all have our ideas about how we should do notes. We all have our ideas whether we need to do research journals or not, right? So the same thing goes with the bibliography, right? If you're going to do the annotated bibliography, make up your own type of annotated bibliography, as long as you don't have to turn it in. What it is that you want to know about the source, and how the source fits with other sources that you're looking at. But these are all things that you can sort of mull over and tell yourself, you know what, this hasn't worked for me in the past. I've never tried this. I do like this idea, or dovetail the ideas. Okay, they're all suggestions, but these are some fantastic ways of knowing how to take notes. And again, like I said, knowing that you really must be active in the research process, and that note taking is a huge part of that. Now, an issue that many students of history have is they have an inability to create a thesis. Many of you are good at creating an argument, but you cannot create a thesis that will carry you through your entire paper, something that is very specific and something that you will be able to parlay into an entire essay, right? And as you move forward, you're going to need to write a capstone project. If you go on for a master's, you have a master's thesis. If you go on for the dissertation, you have or a PhD rather, you have the dissertation. And then beyond that, if you're going to be an academic, you're going to be writing journal articles. You're going to be writing books, and you also are going to be giving lectures when you're doing narrative-based classes, where you need to have an argument for your presentations to your students, right? And many people think that, oh, I could just create an argument. I have an argument. It's an argumentative statement, so therefore I have a thesis. But that's not necessarily true. And some of you have seen this, and many of your professors here at ASU, I'm sure, have pushed very hard against the idea of you creating this sort of very basic, non-specific argument, and then you saying, oh, I have an argument. I do have an argument. Well, you actually have an argument for sure, but you don't have a thesis. You don't have an argumentative thesis that is going to allow you to create a paper that is, first of all, long enough, but that is making a very specific point that you can prove throughout your work. And one of the main reasons why historians work so hard on the creation of a thesis is much like we talked before about the idea that historians are scientists and they are artists at the same time, right? That we really use this idea of creating a hypothesis and then proving that hypothesis, which is actually going to turn our hypotheses into our thesis, right? And so the thesis is really important because that's where you get to the point of creating arguments that are based on original research and are going to have an impact on the field. So that's why we stress this so much, because it's part of that historian's toolbox, the ability to create an argument, one that is going to not only carry you through whatever it is that you're writing, however big, however small, right? But that you are creating a thesis that is actually significant enough to make a mark on the field, okay? So let's go backwards a little bit and talk about how you would do this in an undergraduate paper, right? So I have an argument here. It's the movie JFK inaccurately portrays President Kennedy, okay? As an argument, for sure. But that argument is not very specific, right? And that argument is not necessarily very unique. So what you need to do is to actually create a thesis that is, again, an argument that is strong enough to carry you through a whole paper, strong enough to make your work look original, and then also strong enough to illustrate to people that you have the ability to make a mark on your profession, right? And you want to do this as early as being an undergraduate, right? Because that's how you learn whether or not you are going to have what it takes to move on to the master's thesis, if you're going to have what it takes to move on to become a PhD and an academic, right? So we need a much more specific thesis here, and something that is an argument that really makes a statement and makes a point, hence the thesis statement, right? So the thesis that I've created here is the movie JFK inaccurately portrays President Kennedy because of the way it ignores Kennedy's youth, his relationship with his father, and the findings of the Warren Commission. Now, this is still a very simplistic thesis in the sense that I'm listing what it is that I'm going to be talking about, and we'll create some much more complex arguments on the next slide. But you can see here that it clearly is an argument, it clearly is a thesis, and you can create a very strong paper based on what I have here, right? It gives you three major points to discuss. It gives you three major points to relate back to the movie. You're able to make your points in terms of evidence that you have about Kennedy, and then your understanding of the movie, right? And voila, you have a thesis that is good enough for a paper, right? Again, as you move forward as a historian, you clearly need to have something much more complex than listing what it is that you're going to discuss, but you really do have a strong argument here, okay? So when you're actually going to set down to write a paper based on a thesis like this, and for every other paper you write for the rest of your academic career, and every journal article you may write, and every master's thesis or dissertation or monograph that you might write, um, you really need to not only be able to hone your skills of creating an argument that is highly complex and original, but you have to make sure that you are able to present that to your reader or to your audience if you're giving a lecture, that illustrates your ability to organize not just the sources and not just your analysis, but to organize your narrative, right? And the way that you do that is that every single thing that you are discussing leads back to your thesis, right? It doesn't belong in your piece of work if it doesn't lead back to the thesis. So if any of you have taken classes with me before, you have heard me say this a great deal: all roads lead back to the thesis, right? I say this with certain topics too, like the Civil War. All roads lead back to slavery, right? The cause of the Civil War. So when you're creating an argument, and when you're creating one that needs to be complex, that needs to carry you through a major piece of work, you really have to not just focus on organization. You really can't just focus on, well, I have a lot of evidence. You really have to craft something that leads your reader through your thesis, your reasoning of your thesis, and you proving your thesis. So that's what I mean by all roads lead back to the thesis. So here we have another thesis to look at, okay? So we have a very unspecific, very highly unspecific thesis here that I have created. Eleanor Roosevelt was a strong leader as First Lady, okay? Some people would suggest that this is an argument. I suggest that it is a lacking an argument. And what I mean by that is that anybody could say this, right? We could just point at somebody and say, Bob Smith is a strong leader. It's not really, it's opinion, right? So Eleanor Roosevelt was a strong leader as First Lady is just an opinion. And as you well know, as a historian, you don't put opinions like this out here. You put very complex ideas out there, and then you try to prove them, okay? So I've created a more specific thesis. It's much more elevated than the one that I had for JFK, but it still is one of those theses that is based on this, then this, then this, then this. And the next slide, we're going to be looking at one that I created that is highly complex because it doesn't go through the list, okay? But this becomes a more elevated thesis than, say, the JFK thesis because of one very specific word that I have in this thesis, okay? So I say Eleanor Roosevelt recreated the role of the First Lady by her active political leadership in the Democratic Party, by lobbying for national legislation, and by fostering women's leadership in the Democratic Party. Now, again, it's not as highly evolved as you want it to be because, again, you're listing, but it has evolved much more than the previous JFK one because of the word recreated, okay? The argument is that she recreated the position, and these are the ways that she did it, okay? It has a three-part structure with which to demonstrate just how she remade the job of being First Lady of the United States of America, okay? So you have something here that has a lot of meat to it. You are making an assertive argument that she recreated this position, okay? You're still, again, you don't have quite as complex of a thesis as you would like to have in the sense of, oh, I'm listing it again. But that idea of recreation, that's the meat of your argument, and that is where you would be making your contribution, right? Suggesting that she recreated the role of First Lady. All right. Now, let's move from, we started with JFK with the simplistic thesis that I then made into a better thesis, but still pretty simplistic. Here we have one that really hinges on the idea of recreation, but still is simplistic in its organization, right? Because I'm showing you piece by piece again, okay? So let's look at a thesis that doesn't have this listing. It has a very complex argument and is something that you would be happy to present in even a dissertation, right? Or in an academic journal article. So something that's not doing all the listing for you, but actually has really complex ideas within it. So here's the last thesis that we have to look at. We have this very unspecific thesis at the beginning here. At the end of the 19th century, French women lawyers experienced difficulty when they attempted to enter the legal profession. Okay? As I have here, no historian could argue with this general statement. It is true. But they also couldn't argue with the fact that it's generally uninteresting as well, okay? It's just kind of there. It doesn't really have any significant meat to it. It doesn't tell you, tell the reader where the author is coming from, and where the author is leading them through the paper. It really isn't very original, and it's certainly not very complex, right? Now, in the previous slides, we talked about, that listing of the points that you're going to make, right? Or the listing of what it is that proves your thesis. You want to move away from that. If that's the only way you can do it right now, then of course go ahead, because it allows for you to create organization in your paper, allows you to focus on the research that you need to, on the sources that you need to, and all roads certainly can lead back to the thesis quite easily in a paper that is organized based on a thesis that lists the major assertions that you've made. Okay, but what you want to really do is to start creating theses that are highly developed, that are highly complex, that are roadmaps in a very different way than the one that's listing things, right? That the more complex thesis is a roadmap through your analysis. Okay, so the specific thesis I have here is: at the end of the 19th century, French women lawyers experienced misogynistic attacks from male lawyers when they attempted to enter the legal profession because male lawyers wanted to keep women out of judgeships. Okay, so you're going to have evidence of the misogynistic attacks, and you are going to have evidence from primary sources that are going to tell you that male lawyers really wanted to keep women out of judgeships and would do anything they possibly could to do so, because it is written word. There are written documents that illustrate this, namely letters. Okay, so everything that you have here, it's a highly complex statement. It is a statement that gives you that roadmap through the analysis. And you can clearly see here that if if as a reader looks at it, if you want to prove to the reader that you know what you're talking about and that you're worth your salt as a historian, then you are clearly going to have the sources to back up what you're saying here. Again, misogyny, and then also the idea that women were kept out of the legal profession because men wanted to keep them out of judgeships. Okay, you're telling your reader by writing this that not only is this what I'm asserting, but this is actually what I have the evidence for. And if you don't have the evidence, that's where you're going to be critiqued to say, okay, I understand that this particular author has an opinion about this, but they don't actually back it up with their evidence, right? This roadmap here through your analysis is key for you to be able to check yourself as you're writing, so that you can make sure that you have, dotted all your I's and crossed all your T's in terms of evidence, and the idea that all roads lead back to the thesis. So all roads are going to be you proving the thesis, giving the analysis, presenting the sources that give you the evidence to back up this particular thesis. Okay, so again, as I mentioned before, a lot of students of history really have a very difficult time in creating an argument that's going to run through their entire paper. A lot of students also have issues with creating an argument that's moderately complex and not sticking with it too. So the idea here is to make sure that your thesis is as strong of an assertion as you can make, that creates a roadmap through your evidence, and is backed up by very specific and important and significant and reliable sources, right? And you are literally creating for your reader a roadmap through your mind, right? A roadmap through what you have done in terms of your research in order to prove to someone that you believe that these misogynistic attacks came from the male lawyers because they wanted to keep women out of holding judgeships. Okay, so you have gathered all this evidence, you have analyzed the evidence, and you are ready to sit down and to write. And you are basically telling your reader, when you put that thesis out there, that not only am I going to stick with this and I'm going to tell you a story about this, but that I have the evidence for it. And you will be critiqued by anyone, regardless of whether it's your professor when you're writing a paper or a reviewer when you've put out a monograph. If you are not proving what you have said, then your thesis isn't worth anything. And that's where a lot of historians, professional historians, people who have been doing this for years often get in trouble, is that they absolutely do not stick with the roadmap, and they don't always have the evidence to prove that road, right? To prove that all roads lead back to this thesis. I have the evidence to prove it, and my thesis stands on its own, right? So don't think you're the only one if you have trouble creating a thesis, and certainly creating a highly complex thesis. And always bear in mind that there are even scholars out there who are either not necessarily that good at it, or that end up messing things up in terms of maybe leaving out evidence to prove their thesis, or maybe even forgetting to really engage with a section of their thesis, like a particular portion of their thesis. So you're not the only one if you have trouble with this, and this is really the bread and butter for a historian. The idea that you can create the thesis, you can prove the thesis, you can write a narrative and an analytical narrative rather, that leads back to that thesis, and that you can actually make a contribution, right? It all hinges on your ability to create a highly complex thesis and to stick to it. Okay, so hopefully this discussion has allowed you to understand, number one, how you would create a research question, how you would go about, what's the formula that you should follow to create the research question, and then that it has allowed you to see that you need to answer that research question in a highly complex manner. And that highly complex manner is not only going to be an argument, it's going to be your roadmap through your work. Okay, it's going to be your reader's roadmap through the work. So these are obviously really important things for the historical researcher to be focused on. And I also suggest that it's something that the teacher of history or the professor of history needs to keep an eye on too, in the sense that they're going to be giving lectures that really need to have highly complex arguments, right? You have to have a point when you walk into a classroom. You have to make the point. You have to have all the points in between, and then you really have presented to your audience a organized um, an organized set of material that illustrates to them how to analyze, and actually gives them a major thesis or assertion that allows them to tie the larger narrative together, right? So it's the academic historian that's teaching, as well as the academic historian who is doing research. And I would even suggest this is something clearly that a public historian needs to do in a museum exhibit, right? Or when they're doing talks for the public and to the public. Like it is the bread and butter of the historian. The idea that you are a good historian because you can create a complex thesis, and that you can prove that complex thesis and stick with it. Okay. So again, these are skills that you hone for years and years. So don't get frustrated if this is something that you have a problem with. Most people have a problem with it. And one of the main reasons why they have a problem with it is because it's very difficult to stick with your thesis, right? You go off on tangents, and you're not talking about things that are highly related to your thesis. And then all of a sudden you come back to your thesis, right? And that's obviously poor writing, but that's something that it takes years and years to be able to do properly. It takes years and years to be able to go through the research process and create the research question, and then be able to realize that you can prove the research question, so you can parlay that research question into a thesis, and sit down and write an essay that actually proves that thesis. Okay. So again, the very major aspects of being particularly a historical researcher, but also a teacher or professor of history.